Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the third and final webinar for the 2024 Spring Hydrologic Outlook webinar series for the Greater Mississippi River Basin. I am Joe Sabolka. I'm one of the hydrologists here at the National Water Center. And I'll be giving an update on the general overview for the Greater Mississippi River Basin. So we'll also hear from representatives from each of the 5 river forecast centers for more detailed information on the flood potential for their respective regions. This webinar is being recorded, just as a reminder, and there will be a follow-up email sent with key message information, a link to the story map, a PDF copy of all of the information covered during this webinar, and the recording of the webinar as well. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please go ahead and type it into the question box, and we will address them at the conclusion of the presentations. Okay, so the key message continues to be that the potential for spring flooding across the Greater Mississippi River Basin is below normal to normal, especially across the upper Midwest and northern plains, where flooding potential is below normal due to historic lack of snowpack. And then overall, there hasn't been a significant change to the conditions across the basin from when we talked 2 weeks ago. So now we'll go through some of the current conditions and forecast information and just see how things have or haven't changed over the past 2 weeks and how that's going to play into the spring flood outlook. Okay, so starting with the past 2 weeks, accumulated precipitation departures from mean, you can see in the light yellow and green shades there that the overwhelming majority of the basin has seen generally near normal precipitation amounts over the past 2 weeks, with really the only exception to this being the far lower portions of the Mississippi Basin across Louisiana and Mississippi, where you can see those 2 to 4 inch positive departures from normal in the green shadings there in response to the heavy rainfall event last week. So the main takeaway here is that the overall dry conditions have persisted over the past 2 weeks across the Greater Mississippi River Basin, with some exception to the lower Missouri Basin into western portions of the Ohio River Basin, which has seen a little bit of rainfall in some river responses over the past day and a half or so as the low pressure systems move through that region. Okay, so now we can see how the rainfall over the past 2 weeks has impacted the current soil moisture conditions. And here we are looking at the Climate Prediction Center soil moisture ranking percentiles from 2 weeks ago, shown here, and then the current conditions shown here. And so what sticks out is an increase in those warm colors and an overall decrease in the soil moisture content across the basin, especially across the middle and upper portions of the Greater Mississippi Basin. And that's all helping to mitigate the flood potential this spring. The only region that saw a switch from soil moisture rankings below the 30th percentile to above the 70th percentile, so from those yellow shades to green shades, is going to be across a small area of the lower Mississippi River Basin in southern Mississippi, which it's not a big surprise given the swath of 3 to 8 inches of rain that fell across that region last week. Okay, so now moving on to stream flows across the Mississippi Basin, and here we're looking at the U.S. Geological Survey 14-day average stream flows. And what we're seeing is that the stream flows are generally below normal to normal across the whole basin, with the majority of the below normal to much below normal flows being in tributary basins across the middle portions of the Greater Mississippi Basin, which you can see in those orange and red colors there. So the overall take-home message here is that just about all of the Mississippi Basin has below normal or normal stream flows in place, which is quite unusual for this time of year, and it will reduce the overall potential for flooding this spring. Now taking a look at the longer-term drought conditions. Drought conditions do continue to persist across much of the basin, with a slight expansion of abnormally dry and moderate drought conditions across the upper Midwest through the northern plains and into the Missouri Basin in comparison to where we were at 2 weeks ago here. And then here's the current conditions here, where you can see that slight expansion of the yellows and oranges there for the abnormally dry and moderate drought conditions across northern portions of the basin. So, and of note, moderate to extreme drought does persist across eastern Iowa with perhaps a slight expansion from where we were at 2 weeks ago. Now we'll switch gears a little bit here and look back at the statewide average temperature ranks for December of 2023 through February of 2024. And this is from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's National Centers for Environmental Information. And what you can see here is that all the states in the dark red shadings in the northern plains and upper Midwest, they've experienced record warm temperatures from December through February. And then the entire Greater Mississippi River Basin has experienced above average temperatures this winter season, which has led to that historic lack of snowpack, very little ice on the rivers, and a below normal spring flood threat due to that reduced runoff available this spring. Now we can visually look at the current snow water equivalent across the basin shown here. And really, there's not much to look at here, with virtually no snow water equivalent across the whole basin. And the only notable snow water equivalent remaining continuing to be in the higher elevations of the Intermountain West. So this almost non-existent snowpack is pretty uncommon for this time of year, and it is significantly reducing the flooding potential across much of the basin this spring. And now we'll focus on the forecast over the next few weeks and out into the next couple months, specifically here looking out over the next week at precipitation totals. There will be areas of rain and thunderstorms over the next 2 days across much of the central and southern portions of the basin as a low pressure system tracks through the region, with the greatest precipitation totals likely being in the far lower Arkansas Red and lower Mississippi Basin, where rainfall totals could amount to 2 to 4 inches, which could produce some rises on smaller streams and rivers, but will not impact the main stem Mississippi River itself. And we'll hear more on this from Jessica from the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center later in the webinar. And then across northern portions of the basin, very little to no precipitation is expected over the next week. Now looking out further in the forecast period and focusing on week 2, we'll take a look at the Climate Prediction Center's 8 to 14-day precipitation outlook. And the Climate Prediction Center forecast probabilities lean towards above normal precipitation for much of the basin during the week 2 period, but really there's not a strong signal for any significant precipitation events that would change the spring flood outlook substantially. And then for that same week 2 time period, the Climate Prediction Center forecast probabilities lean towards below normal temperatures for northern portions of the Mississippi Basin. But these temperatures are not expected to change the limited snowpack or minimal river ice that's in place currently. And then further down the road for the months of March, April, and May, the Climate Prediction Center seasonal precipitation outlook suggests potential for above normal precipitation across lower portions of the greater Mississippi Basin, and potentially into the Ohio Basin. And then for during the same time period, the forecast probabilities do continue to lean towards above normal temperatures for the upper portions of the greater Mississippi River Basin, suggesting a continued minimal snow and ice influence on the flood outlook this year. And then also we want to touch on the forecast information from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for the Great Lakes over the next 6 months. And while some of the forecast numbers have changed a little bit, shown on the right, all lakes besides Lake Superior do remain above long-term average levels, but are forecast to remain well below the record high levels this spring and through the early summer. And now to show how all these conditions we've covered over the past few weeks will impact the flooding forecast across the greater Mississippi River Basin this spring. The long-range river flood outlook shows that the risk due to snowmelt is significantly below normal due to a historic lack of snowpack this season. And then the potential for spring flooding across the entire greater Mississippi River Basin is below normal to normal. And just as a reminder that while the spring flood potential is below normal, localized heavy rainfall at any time can lead to flooding, even in areas where the overall risk is considered low. And so now I'll pass it to Brian at Ohio Basin River Forecast Center for more details on that region.
Thanks, Joe. This is Brian Astafan at the Ohio River Forecast Center, and go through our region's summary here briefly. Overall, as Joe mentioned, we're looking at flood risk through the spring, considering normal to below normal. Our areas generally south of Interstate 70, which runs roughly from Indianapolis to Columbus to Pittsburgh. Areas along and south of that line have a normal flood risk for this year. Areas to the north where we've seen less snowfall and away from kind of the favored rainfall track, which we've seen all winter, which is tracked through the southeast and up along the eastern seaboard, do have a below normal flood risk this year. A normal flood risk for us in a given year does have widespread minor flooding throughout Indiana, Western Kentucky, and portions of Western Ohio. And you can see some reflection of that here as we're looking at the kind of the most likely outcome of flooding through the year. And we've seen some of this already through the flood season in the Ohio Valley. Typically, our wettest season is January through early April. We're kind of at the peak of our flood season now, and we've seen several rounds of storms come through and produce kind of something along this line of flooding. We're not anticipating major flooding anywhere, nor a prolonged flood season. And if you move on to the next slide, this graphic shows kind of our high-end anticipated level of what we would see from a flood perspective. So kind of what the peak in any given area would be at a 25% exceedance level. And in this case, you can see we've picked up a few more minor stages, some isolated moderate flood stages. And again, this is kind of what we've seen and kind of the high end of what we would anticipate for the next month or so in our primary flood season here. Overall, there's been about a 5 to 20% reduction in our flood risk this spring across the board, with the heaviest reductions being seen across the northern third of our basin in comparison to historical years. So if we move on to the next slide and we look at kind of the near range here over the next 10 days or so, we are seeing a system move through the region right now, a couple rounds of convection this afternoon, and again, overnight and into tomorrow, which is increasing our short-term flood risk kind of into that bank full to minor flood range there in Indiana and into northwestern Ohio. Beyond that, our next chance of significant rainfall is about a week out. And the same areas are generally looking at another possible return to near bank full stages at that time. So rainfall continues to be the driving factor. What generates flooding for us in the springtime typically is 2 or 3 rainfall events following in close succession. We've avoided that for the majority of the winter, and at this point don't see any of that type of back-to-back system in the near future either. So overall, again, in the Ohio Valley, we're looking at normal to below normal flood conditions, both for the remainder of the flood season and here in the next 2 weeks. And with that, I'm going to pass it on up to Sean in North Central RFC.
All right, thank you very much, Brian. Yeah, so here in North Central RFC's area, the overall flood risk is certainly well below normal this year. As you saw from Joe earlier, we had a very warm winter, record-breaking for many locations across this part of the country. 5 of the states we serve saw their warmest overall winter on record, considering December, January, and February. With that, as Joe said, historic lack of snowpack. Typically, the map here would be sprinkled with the various other colors, but it's mostly green this year, especially across the north, just with that lack of snow that's out there. Earlier in these outlooks, we've had some snow, and we have since melted that off and let that infiltrate into the soils in the north, and so our flood risk has continued to decrease. You can see in the southern part of our area, we do have a few, about 20 minor, or in a couple, 2 moderate locations there. Nothing expected to hit major this year. There is an ongoing event now out there where we're seeing some rises from lower Michigan through Illinois, but again, not significant river flooding. And drought conditions have eased somewhat since last fall due to the winter precip overall, but the drought still does persist in much of the area, and with essentially very little QPF in the next 7 days, we expect that to continue to grow. I did want to point out there, the QR code will take you to our NCRC Spring Hydro Outlook if you want more details specifically on our area. So let's go ahead and take a look to compare the SWE from this year to last year at this time. 2 different worlds we're living in from this year to last year. Last year on the left there, the dark blue shading shows us that we were in our top 10% of our modeled history in terms of how much water was on the landscape in the snowpack, whereas this year much of the area is grayed out because there's simply no snow. To the northern tier, those red and orange colors just show us that we're much below normal, where we should be for mid-March in terms of how much water is in the snowpack there. So This is the lack of snowpack, so essentially our risk of flooding is dependent on future rainfall. And with that, I'm just going to pass it on to Kevin Lau at MBRFC. Thank
Joe, can you hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you now. I cannot hear you now, Kevin. I heard you for a second. Still not getting your audio, Kevin. Let me try to unmute you. Okay, not getting Kevin's audio. I'll go through the key messages for the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center region. The flood risk varies across the Missouri River Basin from a near normal risk to a below normal risk, and no areas within the basin have an above normal risk for flooding this spring. And while soil moisture conditions have improved over the last year, the current U.S. drought monitor shows a 65% of the basin as being abnormally dry or worse. And there is a 50% or greater probability of minor to moderate flooding through the lower Missouri River Basin this spring. You can see all the clustering of minor to moderate points, generally focused in the state of Missouri, and not a whole lot of flooding expected as you head further north and west throughout the upper portions of the basin. Okay, so we can compare we can take a look at the snow water equivalent across the upper portions of the Missouri Basin. And the mountain snowpack is well below the average in the northern Rockies and near average in the Platte River system. And typically by the state, we've seen about 85% of the seasonal peak snow water equivalent accumulated in the mountains. And so you can see on the image on the left there, the snow water equivalent percents from NRCS. Many of the basins in those yellows and orange in the 70 to 90% and 50 to 70% range. So much below normal for snow water content there. And then on the right is the April through September volumetric water outlook for the mountain runoff, and the latest National Weather Service water supply outlook does indicate a below normal mountain runoff season this year. Okay, so we will be able to open it up for questions at the end if there's any more for the Missouri Basin region. And I will pass it to Becky at Arkansas Red Basin RFC.
Thank you much, Joe. Since our risk for springtime river flooding is driven by our climatology of convective rain events, the long-range river risk for ABRFC is still near normal. The signal that we were seeing for increased chances of springtime flooding in southeast Kansas is now a little less pronounced than it was about 2 weeks ago. This spring, we're expecting minor flooding and moderate flooding on the Neosho and Poto rivers in Kansas and Oklahoma, and Cow Creek in Kansas. We're also expecting some instances of minor flooding throughout our basin, as you can see, including some locations on the Arkansas, Illinois, Cottonwood, Cimarron, Little, Fushlavov, Chikaskea rivers, and the Deep Red and Slate Creeks. Now, taking a look at our snowpack, as an overall basin average, the snow water equivalent for the Arkansas and Red Basin headwaters together is currently below normal. However, if you look at the subbasins, the snow water equivalent is highly variable, ranging from a low of near 61% of normal for the Huerfano subbasin up to 168% of normal for the upper Arkansas Basin. And a quick word about our reservoir systems. They're in great shape for the spring. We've got 99% of the flood storage capacity for the Arkansas River Basin system currently open, and 98% for the Red River Basin. Now I'll turn it over to Jessica Smith with the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center to talk about their area.
Becky. So down here on the lower portion of the river, we haven't had much change in our overall thinking from 2 weeks ago. The rains over the past 2 weeks did help our stream flows bounce back on the Ohio and into the Mississippi Channel. So it's given us a little bump of water. We've got some QPF forecasted over the next several days in the southeast that could produce some minor rises along our smaller rivers. And that's showing up on our LRO map as our moderate points across the state of Mississippi. But none of that QPF we're really expecting to affect the main channel of the Mississippi. Our main focus and messaging continues to be that the flood threat across the lower portion of the river is going to be below normal to normal, with no snowpack across the north feeding our base flows on the Ohio, Upper Miss, and Missouri. We're not expecting any prolonged flooding or any major flooding. All of the flooding that we expect would be event-based from springtime rainfall. Our reservoirs also have all or nearly all of their flood storage available as well, and that'll be able to help offset any potential spring rains that we do get. On our next slide, we've got a couple of graphs for Cairo, Illinois, and that's the point that everyone seems to look at, and it's a good indicator of what's going to happen on the lower portion of the river. So on the graph on the left, this is our 90-day extended stream flow prediction exceedance outlook. And so this run is to the right of climatology. And so what that means is that we're running drier than Climo. On the graph on the right, we have the 28-day hydrologic ensemble forecast system outlook. And this uses 16 days of forcing to come up with this run. And so it's indicating that our water levels should remain in the current zone, fluctuating slightly, but near current levels through the middle of April. And so the important thing on this chart to realize is that there is no flooding indicated there as well. So both of these are indicating for the lower portion drier conditions and suggests lower chances of flooding on the lower portion of the river. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Joe at the Water Center.
Awesome. Thanks, Jessica. And thank you, everybody, for those great briefings. So in summary here, for the spring flood outlook this season, the flood risk due to snowmelt is significantly below normal due to that historic lack of snowpack. And then the potential for spring flooding across the entire greater Mississippi River Basin is below normal to normal. And just as a reminder that while the spring flood potential is below normal, localized heavy rainfall at any time can lead to flooding, even in the areas where the overall risk is considered low. Okay, so if you have any questions for any of today's presenters, please utilize the question box or the chat box, and I'll give it just a minute here to see if anything comes in. Okay, not seeing any questions out there. So thank you for tuning in, everyone. Just a reminder, there will be a follow-up email sent with the key messages, a link to the story map, a PDF copy of all this information, and the recording of the webinar. So please reach out to either your River Forecast Center or us here at the National Water Center if you have any questions or need any information. Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in, and have a great weekend.